Today's scripture lessons are two familiar tales or stories, so you might find these familiar. First one is Genesis 37, 1 through 4, and 12 through 28. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age. And he had made a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent them from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" The man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal had devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into the pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with the sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay down our hands on him. For he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Our second reading is from Matthew 14, 22 to 33. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
Our youngest son, Joseph, one day was having lunch with his father when he was about 3 or 4 years old. And my husband looked at his plate and said, "Now, Joseph, you can't just eat your French fries. You have to eat your sandwich too." And Joseph said, "Daddy, you need to pay attention to your own plate. That's what they teach us in daycare." Joseph, from our Bible text today, didn't go to daycare. He was kind of a brat, to be honest. I mean, first of all, he is the child born to Rachel and Jacob. And Rachel was the woman that Jacob really wanted to marry, but Rachel's father said, "Oh, no, you have to marry Leah because she's the oldest." And then he had to work for the father-in-law for 7 years before he could finally get to Rachel. And then they had their midwives, and Jacob had children from all 4 women. So when someone says to you, we need to go back to the Bible and have that definition of marriage, you might want to share this story and make them change their mind just a little bit. Now, what we don't get through this, there's a lot that's missing from this text, is that Joseph had dreams. And Joseph wasn't afraid to tell his brothers about his dreams. And in his dreams, his parents and his brothers, all of them bow down before Joseph, and he lets them know it. And it doesn't help that he is Jacob's favorite child. Jacob makes him this extravagant coat with long sleeves. It's really not a Technicolor dream coat. It's just a coat with long sleeves. With the indication of that being that if this has long sleeves, he couldn't really toil or work. So Joseph wasn't meant to work like his brothers. And it doesn't help that Jacob sends Joseph off into the wilderness to find out what his brothers are doing to report back to him whether or not they're working hard or not. This is a perfect storm of sibling rivalry. It's a perfect storm of a parent having favorites and feeding that rivalry of his own children. Now, you remember the story about Jacob and Esau, right? Because he was an upstanding character. Not. Jacob tricking his brother into his birthright. I mean, so there's a long line here of bad behavior. And that bad behavior causes a lot of chaos for this family. All of a sudden, Joseph just disappears. We don't know where he went, Dad. You know, I wish I knew I could sell my brothers into slavery. I didn't know that was an option. But they sold him off to Egypt. And the chaos continued in the family because the favored child now is missing. In our gospel lesson, we have the disciples in a boat in a stormy sea. And the stormy sea for that early community was a symbol of chaos. So the disciples are in chaos in the boat, on the sea. They're panicking. They're afraid. They see this figure coming towards them. They panic even more because they think it's a ghost. And then when they realize it's Jesus, Jesus calms things down for them, and they can go on their way. And Peter, you know Peter, well, if Jesus could walk on water, so can I, right? Well, that didn't go well. Both of these stories bring to us the reality of life. And one of the realities of life is that life is full of chaos. And sometimes that chaos is a storm that comes upon us that we really don't have a lot of control over. But sometimes that chaos is chaos that we create ourselves with our relationships and our families. Everything that goes on for Jacob's family is avoidable. There are ways not to show so much favor towards one child. There are ways to try to help your children get along at least a little bit. There are ways not to sell your brother into slavery. They didn't take conflict management, I don't think. And yet, out of both of these stories, there is grace and there is hope. Jesus comes and calms the storm and gives those disciples hope and some reprieve. Yes, Joseph ends up going into slavery in Egypt, but his dreams all of a sudden come in handy if you read the rest of the story, because Joseph starts to have dreams and share them with the Pharaoh, and it saves his life. And eventually, he comes back to be reunited with his family. The chaos is real. The chaos is frightening. The chaos can be horrific. And it's not whether or not we find ourselves in chaos. It's what we decide to do within the chaos. Do we fight it tooth and nail? Or do we try to find a way to listen to the voice of God in the midst of the chaos to find our way through it? Another word for it could be conflict. So many people are conflict avoidant. But conflict isn't always a bad thing. Conflict is basically two different ideas coming together that aren't the same. And sometimes out of those two separate ideas coming together, a third one evolves that is transformative. Churches, I know, not you. Churches are notorious for chaos. They're notorious for conflict. And unhealthy churches get caught up in that conflict and blow it out of the water. Healthy churches enter into the conflict and say, okay, what can we do with this? Here we are. This is where we find ourselves. What are our options out of this? And where can we go from this? What new thing can come out of this? Avoiding conflict creates more chaos. Entering into it and seeing it for what it is creates possibility. Joseph didn't have a lot of choice about his conflict or his chaos, but he found a way to use it to transform his reality and eventually saved his family back home who was in a famine. What would the disciples have done on their own? Would they have capsized? Would they have panicked and done something ridiculous? But Jesus came in and said, hey, I got this. We all have moments in life when we're caught up in a storm. And sometimes we panic. Sometimes it is a bit much for us to handle. But every time we're caught up in life storms and we take a deep breath and look where God could be working with us in the midst of that storm, we come to the point where we can see the rainbow. So think about where you are in your life right now. Think about the storms that you've had in your life. Think about the storms that may yet to come. And embrace the gift of God's grace so that you too can see the rainbow at the end of the storm. Think about, in the midst of that chaos and that storm, about your gifts that you've been given. And now you can use your gifts to transform your chaos into something meaningful and hope-filled. Joseph could do it. The disciples learned to trust Jesus. It's time for us to trust ourselves and the gifts that God has given us. Because the storms are going to come. That's life. But how are we going to embrace the gift of God in the midst of whatever storm comes? That's the question. Amen.